I brought this material through by tapping into the life of Joseph, the father of Jesus, through the Akashic records, where all experiences and knowledge and wisdom gained in each incarnation feeds back to. The stories in part 1 are about the childhood years of Jesus from the time he was a baby until he reached his teens. Chapter 3, Helping Others. One parable used by Jesus is as follows. There was a group of men in the forest cutting wood. It was in the middle of the winter. They had a sled and all had axes. When the sled was almost filled, the horses bolted and went down over a hill, spilling the whole load. The men had to stop cutting more wood, making forward progress, and spend precious time reloading the sled. It didn't take as long as the first time because they didn't have to cut it this time, just pick it up and restack it. But daylight was fading fast, and their original goal of having the sled fully loaded and ready to leave the woods before sunset did not work out. They had a choice, either leave with the partly filled load or spend the night in the bitter cold of the forest and finish the job the next day. It was a long ways home, and they wanted to be sure they had enough wood cut. They spent the night, a miserable night, cold, shivering, and cursing the horses that had become frightened and ran, causing the delay which was causing their present misery. The horses were being blamed when the problem really lay with the planning. The project should have had an earlier start, so the time pressure was not on them, and the horses should have been watched more closely, so nothing could have startled them. Time was in the early years of Jesus' life when he would cry about anything or anyone in pain and discomfort. He actually could feel the pain of others, and most of the time didn't realize what particular person's pain he was feeling. Joseph and Mary knew what was going on, and also knew that he had to develop protection against this sort of thing, or it would wear him down. They explained what was going on to him and put him on alert to figure out whether it was his true emotion or pain, and if not, to ignore it. He spent a good many years learning to discern between feelings of his own and those of others, but he eventually was able to do this. Many were the times when Joseph and Mary discussed Jesus' role in the plan and knew it was going to mean a very sad life for them if they let themselves dwell on what was coming. They made an agreement with each other to strive to remain cheerful, knowing what was ahead of them all. Jesus knew what he had to do, and he did it with no more assurance of the validity of his visions than those today have. It is an inner knowing of that which must be done. He was a joy to be around due to his curiosity and wonder about everything. He had a typical boyish streak of devilment in him, but it was not malicious. When he became older, this gradually turned into gentle teasing of those close to him, always done with love. Once a wise man journeyed into the area surrounding the Jordan Sea. People traveled from great distances to hear him and question him. Joseph, Mary, and Jesus were among those who listened, and afterwards Jesus approached the man with many questions. He was about 8 at this time. The man could not answer the questions and didn't want to be embarrassed in front of the crowd, so he pretended to be in a hurry and took the attitude that he didn't have time for an unimportant 8-year-old asking silly questions. This upset Jesus and shook his foundation and his belief in himself. It took a lot of explaining by Joseph and Mary to the child on the way home that the man was a hypocrite and a very weak, not too intelligent wise man. The wisdom of an 8-year-old threw him into a frenzy and made him run. As a child, he would wonder about everything. He had so many questions that he drove his parents into a frenzy trying to keep up with him. He then would gather his brothers and sisters around him and practice teaching them, even though some were too young to understand any of it. He taught about the stars and the sun and the moon. He told them all, including his parents, what life was like on his distant star. He also taught about the rhythm of the universe and the cycles in each life. He told his parents that he had a mission to fulfill. The details weren't totally clear in his mind at that time, but he sensed it would not be pleasant. He had 2 friends that almost killed each other one day fighting over a whip that one boy had found. The other said it belonged to his father, and the fight started with the first boy using the whip on the other. Jesus managed to get a hold of the whip, and the 2 fought on without it. Jesus sat calmly watching the fight and cutting the whip into wee small pieces. When he was done, he took each boy by the arm and asked them what they were fighting about. When they said the whip, Jesus says, "Why don't you share it?" They asked, "How could you do that?" And Jesus showed them 2 equal piles of pieces of the whip. He said it would be better to patch up the friendship, seeing as how there was nothing left to fight over anyway. He said, wouldn't it be better to have a good friend and no whip than to have no friend and no whip either? The sun was setting one evening with a beautiful display of color. Everyone in the village paused at their task to watch this gorgeous sight. There was a group of urchins playing at the end of a dusty road, and a fight broke out between them. It seems that one of them had done something that the others couldn't understand. This one had befriended a poor old gentleman and given him the food that was supposed to be for the entire group to eat for their noonday meal. The other children were so angry they were beating with their fists on this lad. The lad took all the meanness he could stand, and then he stood up as straight and tall as possible and started berating the group. He told them they were self-centered, selfish, mean, nasty, and ugly, and everything else he could think of. He asked them all to consider what it would be like to be old and have nothing of value and nothing to eat. Would they like to starve to death as this poor old man was doing? He asked them if they didn't consider themselves lucky that they had someone to take care of them and feed them. With that, he left the group and went back to his home, where he vowed to do what he could on his own, alone, to help the poor and wretched people that he could reach through whatever means he could find. When the other boys in the group heard of his struggles to help the poor and feed the lonely, they came one by one to offer their help in whatever way they could. Eventually the group was back together, and instead of being at odds with one another and fighting amongst themselves, they worked together in harmony with each other for the good of all. If this one lad had not had the courage to go against the group and do something on his own, even though they considered it stealing food from them, which it actually was, then the group would not have the effectiveness that it now was showing. And after he had done this deed they all felt was so wrong, he had to have the courage to defend his actions. This is the quality of leadership. This lad was Jesus.